Everybody. I'd like to welcome you to Peter F. Hamilton in Conversation. So just to give a brief intro before we get started, Peter F. Hamilton is one of the UK's best-selling science fiction authors, master of his art and creator of incredible imagined worlds. His debut novel was published in 1993 and he's now written over 20 novels. And if you could see the length of some of those novels, you'd know that that's even more of an achievement than it seems, as well as volumes of short stories, novellas, and he's had work adapted for Netflix. I'm Bella Pagan, Peter's editor, and I'll be talking to Peter about his work, his writing techniques, and about maintaining creativity in lockdown, amongst other things. And we at Pan Macmillan are delighted to be hosting this conversation with Peter in association with Toppings Bookshop as part of our Virtually Together online tour. This is a celebration of creativity in these strange, strange times. And who better to understand strange times than a science fiction author? So, to start with the present, before we move to the far future, we seem to be living very science fictional times. Our current COVID-19 scenario might once have belonged in a novel, but it's now very real. So, Peter, do you think being a science fiction writer has prepared you mentally for what we're going through now?
It's given me a little bit of an out. I think you'd be better off asking that question of someone who writes zombie novels, given
Are we the zombies?
well, yeah, we don't get out much, do we?
No.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of as aware of it as anyone, really. I don't think preparing you is quite the right phrase. Sort of understanding it a bit better, perhaps.
Yeah.
The limits and maybe get an inkling of the science. Although the science seems to be mostly statistics.
Yes.
Which is,
changeable statistics at that.
Changeable statistics.
Yes.
It's interesting that science is supposedly driving the politics. And that politics are playing a huge part of it. I don't just mean we just have the whole Dominic Cummings thing, but I mean having to adapt the lockdown to what people are actually prepared to put up with.
Yeah.
Is an interesting aspect of it, which possibly hadn't been covered terribly well by zombie fiction or indeed science fiction.
The psychological aspects, the more sort of soft science.
I mean, I'm fine because we've got a garden for the kids to run around in, but you know, people in cities, it's a lot harder.
Well, that's why you get the park seethe, as I've come to know it, and you certainly see a lot of park zombies in there, sort of wandering around, kind of filling up the spaces.
Yeah, I've seen pictures. I think it was in America where they've painted circles in the park, and you've got to stay inside your circle because it's 2 meters from the next circle.
Oh yeah, I think that's Central Park. That's quite a good idea.
Park. Oh right, okay. Yeah. Which is a good idea. Although people are kicking up about it because it seems very authoritarian, but it's what you've got to do to flatten the curve.
Yeah. I think sociologically, it goes against sort of certain libertarian sort of principles that have been baked into society for some time. And that's just one of the interesting things about what we're going through now. I just wonder along those lines, is there anything you found surprising about the pandemic, or how we've reacted or adapted to it kind of psychologically, or, you know, as countries or as individuals?
I think it's interesting the way that certain things have caught on. This clapping for the NHS on a Thursday night, which they think last Thursday would probably be the last one, the one that's just gone. Then you've got things like I'm just down the road from Glastonbury, who they found someone selling, basically it was a USB stick, which he says gives you immunity from 5G. And he was selling it for something like 340 quid, whereas he took it apart and it's actually just a perfectly normal USB stick you can get for about 11 quid. So there's all sorts of...
I do like to ask, but where are you supposed to insert it? Never mind, don't answer that question.
In your computer, and it protects you from the new 5G. It's interesting how those kind of rumours start, that 5G mobile signals amplify the virus because Wuhan had 5G first and it came from Wuhan first. So things like that, which I find incredibly funny, but a lot of people do tend to sort of believe in it still, which is strange.
I guess people try and find patterns and reasons to explain the unexplainable sometimes, or to give us a sense of control in the world.
But yeah, so there's all sorts of things that you don't quite expect from a pandemic, which is fascinating to me, which will all sort of go into creating new societies at some point in the future when I write about them.
Absolutely. I mean, this is it's a terrible situation, but you can't help but absorb certain concepts as a science fiction writer, I'm sure, about because it's like a science fiction scenario in action. I mean, if only it wasn't a game, or if only it was a game or a novel, but we're seeing this running out ahead of us, and no one can predict how people will behave. It's sort of fascinating, but awful to be trapped in this situation.
Yeah.
And to take a more personal sort of note, on a more personal note, how have you found maintaining creativity in lockdown? I mean, I know that you work from home and in a very focused way anyway. Has much changed?
That's the interesting thing is it's not that different for writers. I mean, not everyone can work from home. It's always a great idea, you'll be at home all the time, you won't have to face the commute, whatever. But actually being in this kind of isolation, I've known people who were trying to do it sort of years ago, and it's not for everyone. So from that point of view, there's not been a lot of change. I mean, I miss going down to the pub and we miss going out as a family.
Of course.
But from a work point of view, there is nothing different.
I think some writers maybe take to coffee shops because they enjoy the stimulation of the buzz of the people around them that you don't get.
I've done that. I've written in coffee shops. I had to, it was a couple of years ago when we were living up in the Midlands, when Felix had a holiday classes in Cambridge. So I would drive him over to Cambridge, spend the day going around coffee shops and collect him in the evening. I have to say I'm happier in my office than I am in a coffee shop. I mean, I've written in all sorts of places, but I'm probably getting small c conservative in my old age. So I'm happy here with my big screens and music playing loudly, as that kind of thing. It's just what I'm comfortable doing now. So yeah, working from home is what I do anyway.
So the creation of new galaxies is kind of easier in the home than in Starbucks.
Yeah, yes, basically.
I think it probably needs a lot of focus for sure. And another, thinking again about the way you write, you've often been sort of, I suppose, labelled as a writer of an optimistic future. A lot of science fiction is dystopian, but you really seem to see a way forward for humanity that's a really positive one, where we're harnessing new technology and finding peace. And adventures obviously arise from fractures in that, but at base you seem to see a good future. Would you say that
long-term optimism? I think
yeah.
You're right. I mean, I do put my characters through hell.
Yes.
There's no denying that, which makes for a more interesting story. But yes, the long-term general optimism. I mean, there's always going to be the sort of outliers of society where things aren't so rosy. I don't see technology particularly saving us from that. Again, it's all down to people's own attitudes towards life. We are not the monoculture that so much science fiction used to paint us as. So yes, for general terms, optimism in the long-term future. I mean, this is always the thing with technology. It has the potential to deliver rewards. Whether we use them or abuse them is again down to the individual.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, technology has been so key in this lockdown to keep us connected, even though we're physically apart.
That was one of the more interesting aspects of it. If this had happened 10 years ago, we would not have dealt with it as well as we have, certainly from a business point of view. The internet, certainly broadband internet, has come along just in time businesses to not carry on before, but certainly carry on and start assessing how we're going to cope in the future in this new normal we keep getting promised. We can do the plannings. You and I can Zoom like this.
Absolutely.
I know you're in the office, you're all Zoom meetings now, which is kind of cutting back on the necessity of all gathering together in the office. Whether this devolves entirely from people being forced to work from home, or whether there will be local hubs, we can go down, here in the village, go down and we can all, everyone who needs an office meeting can just go there, and there'll be the water cooler, and it won't be people from your business, it'll be people from other businesses you gather social events with. So it'll be interesting to see how it does evolve from this.
I think that in London and other bigger cities, we're seeing a sort of move, we have been seeing a move towards that already, where freelancers can share office space, but it's been on a very kind of limited basis, for sort of maybe creative freelancers like to share this office space, perhaps IT freelancers like to share, but I mean, certainly not on a company-wide basis. And maybe that's, as you say, we'll kind of move to new ways where we're not so office-based as a society, rather than as a sort of section of the workforce.
In that respect, this is more of a tipping point. I mean, given that this technology was all in its infancy anyway, it possibly would have been the way we were going to go eventually in 10 years' time. But this has certainly tripped us into the fast lane, if nothing else. I mean, I know people are saying, well, stagger your times to work to ease up the crowding on public transport.
Yes.
Yeah, great idea. Who staggers to what hour, please? We can't just say stagger it and expect everyone to automatically slot into whatever their slot is going to be. This has to be organised and thought out. It's all very well throwing out ideas, but you've got to make them practical ones and give guidance, which is possibly where we're all falling down a bit at the moment, or still struggling to adapt to.
Well, as we touched on earlier, it's hard in a society such as ours, which is used to free will, to kind of trammel people into those kind of rigid sort of forms of behaviour. Whereas perhaps in other countries with a more authoritarian system, it's easier to issue rules and they're just being obeyed. But as you say, we're not a monoculture. It's been fascinating to see how different countries react. Yeah,
we have free will, but we've also got a lot of goodwill. I mean, you can see the common sense in this separation, this social distancing. But like I say, how long it can last at its current level before people get utterly fed up. Oh, it hasn't affected me. I'm not gone down with a disease. I'm okay. So why am I being held in my house?
Yes,
it's an understandable attitude to take.
Yeah. So this whole sort of virtual working and everything, I think that, big sort of global conflicts such as wars, and now we're seeing with the pandemic, we can really accelerate technology and medicine and the areas which are specifically needed, as you say, push us into the fast lane. Is there any sort of development that you found particularly fascinating, sort of other than the ability to, mobilize online?
I think what's come to the fore here is our logistics ability. I think that's been a key factor in this. How the supermarkets have managed to keep supplying us with food. Absolutely. Again, I don't know how much technology has played a part in this that is available these days and not prior. But certainly the rise of communications and the ease of communications must have played quite a part in this.
Yes, yeah. Perhaps it'll make us a more efficient and reactive society.
Well, yes, that's the other thing. I mean, people are stuck at home, and you're beginning to realise, yes, I don't need the absolutely top new model of mobile phone that's got to be replaced, even though the old one is perfectly good. So maybe that and of course, there's the whole thing about how pollution's been reduced very noticeably since this has happened. So maybe that will help raise awareness of those factors, how we should be.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we're still rolling with it, aren't we?
If we can, introduce more closed loop manufacturing, that kind of thing. So yeah, and of course we've had in the UK, we've had several days now of no power produced from coal plants.
Wow, I didn't realise that. That's extraordinary, isn't it?
I don't know if it still is, but it was certainly it has happened during the lockdown because industry is not drawing so much power. Obviously, we're going to have to go back to it, but we've seen it is actually possible to produce from alternatives to carbon.
So maybe we're becoming less dependent on traditional fuels, so less dependent on the old ways in some ways, but so much more dependent on the internet. I mean, you hear about EMP strikes in kind of science fiction novels. Can they take out the internet? I'm probably being very unscientific, but
they're more likely to take out the power network first.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Of course, that's what I meant.
Yeah, I mean, there's still, but the only level of EMP that can do that is a nuclear blast, which is a bit, you can't refine it down to just the EMP. I mean, the EMP is part of it.
Yes.
So let's hope we're not going there.
Well, I think that's reassuring. So to move towards your books themselves, I'm thinking of any new readers that might be watching this, who've yet to discover the exciting universes that you create. Where would you say would be a good place for a person new to your work to start?
I do write a lot of series and trilogies, so possibly one of the standalone books would be the very best place to start.
Yeah.
Or even the collections of short stories. If you like the short stories, you're going to like the novel. If you like the standalone novels, you really should like the series. So I'm going to say for an absolute beginner, try Great North Road, which is a standalone. If you like that kind of thing, then you should like most of the rest. You're asking me to name my favourite novel, basically, here, aren't you? Which is terrifically unfair.
Well, you've written so many. I mean, yes, it is unfair.
The thing is, I get this, and I'll give you the honest answer, which always sounds slightly cynical, is the new one is always the favourite.
Well, that's good. It means you're fresh.
Yes. Yes, I mean, if nothing else, then it is so fresh in my mind, and I'm aware of the effort it took to produce it. So the one it's actually not just one novel that I've just finished, it's the three, which is the Salvation sequence. Starting with just Salvation is the title of the first one, then Salvation Lost, and I've just finished going through the copy edits of Saints of Salvation. So that being the latest and most favourite in my terms, which again deals with a conflict that goes far beyond a pandemic. It's an alien species that we didn't realise quite how religious they are when they arrived to greet us, and that's not gone down well for humanity, basically.
No, nobody likes being harvested.
The book is about the fight back. It's about returning, basically, ironically, to the what used to be, returning to the stasis of what we had, the comfortable familiarity of the way we used to be. That is what they spend, millennia trying to return to after this terrible event that happened to us. So from that point of view, it was almost prescient.
Yes, that's true, and it sort of broke an idyllic future. So you had developed an optimistic future, and then the aliens came and spoilt it all.
Yes, well, yeah, but they don't see it as spoiling it. Obviously, that's the point of writing opposite viewpoints, is that the bad guy never thinks they're the bad guy. So yes, but this is what we're wanting now. We're craving now is to get back to how things were, to normality, which is a strange kind of ideal to have in the 21st century.
Yes.
How to go back to the way things were when, from a physical point of view, from a social point of view, rather than any other, is we want that reassurance of normality.
I suppose, people make jokes about people being creatures of habit, and we get outliers who are adventurers, And that's why they're our heroes, because it means we can admire someone going off to do daring do, or we maybe stay at home and sort of, you know, have baked banana bread or something.
And that's where the interest for me lies in writing books. I mean, you mentioned earlier that some of mine are really quite large. Is I like to look at what happens to the little guy when all these great changes are happening around them, and they're not part of it. They just get swept along by events. Is how does someone in the 23rd century react to that? I find that fascinating. I find that one of the raison d'etres of science fiction. Is
Yeah, well,
it's
that's where
not
the
just
drama
about
lies.
the people at the cutting edge, it's about the rest of us.
Yeah, yeah. I think you do a really sort of amazing job of making your fiction so relatable in that way, because you do take the ordinary person and they're pushed through extraordinary events. And that's a way that we, the ordinary reader, perhaps, can relate to your book so well, because we can really perceive the changes, the pressures upon your characters as they're pushed through these dramas. Um, you know, at the moment as well, I think to see a drama other than our own unfolding provides some welcome escapism too.
Well, thank you for that. Yes. Yeah, well, as you say, you should always tell the story through character, and
Yeah.
I don't neglect the guys at the cutting edge, but yes, it's helpful to me to bring in, you know, a bigger picture, if you like.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so yeah, so going on to the sort of the freshness of the book in your mind when you finished it, I suppose all the kind of the drama of writing is kind of very sort of fresh and raw in a way. What's the most challenging part of writing a trilogy? Is it starting? Is it wrapping up all the loose ends at the end?
Oh, well, no, not for me, because I plot it all out in advance, so that those strands really should, unless I've made a terrible mistake, should all come
Yes.
together in the end. It is basically the actual slog of sitting down and typing it out. Despite having all these notes, they're kind of loose enough so that anything fresh comes along, new ideas, new concepts, I can build that in. So it does need a bit of trimming at the end of each book to you know, cut those wild shoots down a bit. Apart from that, the slog part of it is the editing afterwards. Like I said, I've been through the edits, I've been through the copy edits, and when those come back, I'm going to have to go through the galley edits.
And they're so long.
Authors absolutely hate this part of producing a book, I can tell you. It's the practical necessity, and there's no creativity involved. It's like having your English essay marked.
Yes.
And it goes on for hundreds and hundreds of pages. So by the time once I've finished it, by the time it actually gets out to the reader, I will have reread that book about 6 times. And it will no longer be favourite. The one I'm working on will rapidly become the favourite. So yeah, there is that sort of grind of work towards the end, but the actual process of writing it day to day is one I'm used to and happy with and quite enjoy doing, especially when I do have all those, you know, sort of new ideas budding up from what I've written. That's always a fascinating process.
It must be sort of surprising as well when the book finally does come out, and the 3rd book in your trilogy is out this October, because you've been through it so many times, and then you've moved on to the next thing. Do reader responses then kind of surprise you because you've forgotten things about your own book, or because you see your book in a different way because you've had to read it so many times?
I'm always fascinated by what people read into it. That was put into it by me anyway. I mean, it's people's own the filters people have to look through the world are one of the things I find fascinating and use constantly to help write characters. I'll be able to cope with if we go out on a publicity tour or do Q&A sessions. I'll be able to cope with questions about the Salvation trilogy. The trouble gets when people start asking about something I've written 20 years ago, and
Yes.
they read it last week and I haven't read it for 20 years.
Yes,
And
yes,
they
yes.
ask detailed questions, and I'm kind of left struggling for an answer these days.
Because what
I
books
can
are you...
remember the plot lines and I can remember the main characters, but anything else,
I really relate to that, because writing is such an intense process. Well, it must be, because editing is an intense process when you're dealing with the raw material, you know, the sort of writing that's been done. And I can't hold all the minutiae that I've absorbed and commented on as an editor in my head for sort of months and months. So while I'm fresh to it, like you, I can answer all manner of questions, but a couple of months later, that brain space is filled with the new project.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, sometimes those new projects are really large and detailed.
There's no room for the old memories.
Absolutely not. I think that science fiction and fantasy authors have such a huge challenge above kind of writers who write in the real world, because you've got to create the world. You can't depend on the reader knowing what a table is, or, you know, that we get in the car to go to Sainsbury's. You have to create the whole fabric of the book afresh, and then put adventure, character, plot, pace on top of that. So it's very brain bending.
Yeah, but also essential. I mean, we've mentioned that the Salvation trilogy is set in a new universe.
Yes.
Well, the universe I was writing in previously, the Commonwealth, we've got 7 books in that, and which is,
Yes.
I'm not saying I'm not going to go back to it, but I'd need an idea, a plot that would fit it properly. I really do have to write something set in a new universe every now and then. I cannot just keep on writing in the same universe the whole time. I don't want to, because it winds up being quite stale then. So that there is this, I think, I don't even know how many different universes I've managed to come up with, probably about 7 or 8. And I like that progression, if you like, of the, you know, sitting down right at the start of it, and the first thing you do is create this universe, which you do by, okay, where's it set, what's the technology level, how does that knock onto the economics, how does that knock onto the politics, the finance of it all. So each time you can play around with those elements and come up with something new each time, and then the kind of effect ripples out, like we were talking about this pandemic, is the way people behave in those circumstances. And it all builds from that. You can work out, you can base your characters on the behaviour of people in that society.
It'll be really interesting to see how both mainstream writers and science fiction writers react to what's happening at the moment, and also what the readership responds to. I mean, would the readership want books on the pandemic, or would they want something completely different? We just don't know, do we?
I wouldn't have thought anyone wants to read about it in the next couple of years.
No, I know.
But then if you look at sort of all the films that came out in the 50s and 60s, they were all war films.
Yeah.
Which was quite bizarre looking back on it from here.
Yes.
Why do people want to relive that?
Perhaps it was just enough afterwards that people felt safe to revisit it.
Could be, yeah.
Well, we don't know what the distance is between the trauma and the fictionalization of that trauma. When does trauma become drama? I mean, that's a sort of interesting question.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, I won't be writing a pandemic book next, I can tell you that.
Okay. We'll count you out of that then.
Yeah.
But I think that some pandemic books, such as Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11,
yes,
they've really kind of gone up the charts recently. I think some people maybe are trying to find a philosophical framework, or, you know, an echo in what they read.
Yes, I mean, that was an interesting book. I mean, we didn't have this stage of a pandemic. It hit and wiped out an awful lot of people. There was no distancing. There was no warning almost of it.
Yes.
It was a very different pandemic from what we've got now, and it was all about how people coped and their histories and their connections between them all, which wove together very, very well, I have to say.
Yes.
But yes, that's probably the most recent big pandemic book, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. I think Robin Cook wrote a book called Pandemic, but that was a thriller. I don't know sort of a huge amount about it, apart from the fact that Pan Macmillan publishes it. I think it's been a bit of a surprise to me how some pandemic books have really taken off again. But and what the appetite is for more of those books. Like, is sort of 3 or 4 enough, or is there more of an appetite, perhaps afterwards, as you say? But also the way the society has reacted to the pandemic, just different ideas, if not the pandemic itself, maybe sort of ideas and sort of learnings, feelings from it might kind of filter in,
Yeah.
more subtly.
Well, yes, it's got to change our attitudes a bit,
Yeah.
I believe. Well, as we mentioned earlier, we've become aware of consequences of various things because of this. So
Yes.
hopefully we'll get some benefit out of it after all this.
Well, I hope that something might change. Like, for example, greater ability of people with disabilities to function in the workplace because of more working from home sort of capabilities, and the same with people being able to access university courses and such like, who may not have been able to do so before. I mean, there's such a huge trauma and over this whole situation. It's so difficult and impossible for so many people, but like you say, I hope something good will come out of it. That's all we can hope for, I suppose. So I think we might have time for maybe a couple of more questions.
Okay.
So I'm just kind of searching my questions kind of bag. So how about a sort of a general one, maybe for again, for the writers watching? As you've grown as a writer, is there any advice you would give to your younger self if you were starting out now?
What advice would I give to me? I think possibly I didn't used to make quite as many notes as I do now.
Right.
Then I think note making, the way I do it, grows out of experience rather than forcing someone to sit down and plot it out. I mean,
Right.
there's no fixed way of writing. We should say that to writers straight away. Some people, like me, make extensive notes. Some people just sit down and start page 1, chapter 1, and just write. I think certainly the more complex a book, the more you need to make notes and you need to think it through.
Yes.
But again, there are some people who can just, find a resolution as they're writing it, which I quite envy. I am not one of them. I would suggest, and this is, as an editor and publisher, you'll hate this, I would love to just put a book away for a couple of years, then take it out again and look at it with fresh eyes and go through it that way. I know you're never going to let me do that.
Oh God!
But I think being able to take a step back and look at it from that sort of more distant perspective,
yes,
in time, I think that might help polish it up even better than it is at the moment.
Maybe so, but think of your poor readership as well.
Yes,
desperate for your works, and if they knew that there was something in a drawer, it could
it's
be
interesting
painful.
that a lot of people actually don't want to buy a book one year, then wait a year for the next. And
Yes.
some of them will wait until I've written all 3 of the trilogy and then buy it and go into it, which is a fair enough way to do it. Because I have been known to leave some quite horrific cliffhangers in some of my series, so I get where they're coming from on that.
And then people have to wait 18 months to find the answer. Yes.
And they tell me about that quite effusively as well.
I see.
So,
I've heard of that a lot anecdotally. I'd love to have some more facts and figures about it, but it's a very difficult thing to measure an appropriate audience size. So to go to our last question, do you think that this situation might cause more mainstream readers to turn to science fiction, or even maybe the lighter form of science fiction, or perhaps even mainstream readers incorporating more science fiction ideas into their work? Do you think that science fiction seems more relevant now?
I think the lines are more blurred now. I mean, the stuff I've been writing to date is certainly, that is science fiction. At what point does near future just become a tech thriller?
Yes,
I
yes.
mean, people are writing now what 20 years ago would have been considered science fiction, and it's absolute mainstream books.
Yeah.
So the edges are very, very blurred. I think this, I hate to use the word dependence, but certainly we are using technology more. I think people are becoming aware of that and would become interested in seeing or having some ideas of where this is going to go eventually, of how
Yes.
we are going to do this. Like I said, had this happened 10 years ago, we'd have been struggling to cope with the
Yes.
technology, the very basic technology, just improving communications, the way the internet has done, and the way broadband did on top of that, has been a boon in this time. So people maybe want an idea of maybe how things are going to go. We all now live in an age of there is no job for life. So yeah, I think people might be a little more interested in the future.
I think so. Yes, things like cloning, you know, changing sort of characteristics in our children, all that kind of thing. They've become a lot more mainstream now, haven't they?
Yes, but I mean, even though we all now know the timetable for designing a vaccine for a virus,
Yes.
it's not just as it's shown in the science fiction films and movies that you go into the office or the lab, and a week later you'll come out clutching the file with the medicine in.
Absolutely, yes.
So yeah, I mean, this sort of general awareness of the way technology affects and is shaping our world is one I think people will become more in tune with.
Well, thank you, Peter. It's been a tremendous pleasure to interview you for Virtually Together. And thank you for, gracing us with your imagination as well, which is always a huge pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye.